Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me. I've been really debating on how, when, and if to do this episode. It's been on the editorial calendar for some time, even before Ukraine came under attack by Russia. And there is a note on the official website of Ukraine that says this site has not been updated since the morning of February 24th. At this time, Russia invaded Ukraine. From that very moment, Ukrainians froze at the end of winter. Well, this episode will air on 24 June, exactly 4 months to the day, an entire flowering and fruiting season lost in some areas because of this violence. Vineyards have become fighting grounds, some wineries completely leveled or have been occupied by Russians. It seems quaint to focus on the wine industry right now in light of all the destruction in this country, but just a beverage to some people is a livelihood, centuries of family traditions, and hard work for others. It's a way of living. It's a way of life. And just for this episode, I want to focus on the wine culture, what Ukraine had built, and pay homage to it. If we've seen anything during these 4 months that can provide hope, it is that democracy-loving countries have united in the name of peace. I've decided to go ahead and record this episode, not just for history and awareness in the wine community, but also for the awe-inspiring demonstrated grit, determination, and boldness of the Ukrainian people and their young leader. Their artfulness in not taking any crap from misguided Russian troops is inspiring. Grandmas who remember being under Soviet rule, they're not having it. Kids are showing resilience and bravery unimaginable. And I must admit, the swearing is iconic. It's an honest expression of the fighting spirit. And what I'm saying here is that freedom-minded people of the world have gotten a taste of the Ukrainian spirit. And most of us, we are rooting for decency. So before I go on, let me spew forth this disclaimer. This episode is not sponsored by any winery or media organization. There are no kickbacks, authorized ads, no partnerships. While the trademark Glass in Session is owned by my very small business, Vino with Val, LLC, you should know I dedicate time, energy, and resources to this production because I love doing it. I'm not serving any commercial or corporate purposes. It is my creativity, passion for writing and booze to fine talking. I love talking. The combination thereof, this is what brings me to the mic every couple of weeks. Many of you know, since retiring from a 25-year military career, I've been all about the wine all the time. And I'm here to share what I've learned in the 13 years since retiring. What I continue to learn, I'm also here to share. And there's so much information, so many stories to tell. I'm grateful for those of you that keep listening, that want to listen. And as someone who did wear the uniform for nearly half my time on this crazy planet, I do value being able to speak freely about my views, even while I'm sipping a glass. So if you're still listening, thank you, hardcore listener. You are awesome. Here's the story I wish to tell you about Ukrainian wine from the lens of history and today's reality while clinging to hope for the future. I hope I do it justice. I dedicate this episode to the Ukrainian spirit, to democracy, which is endangered around the world, to human decency, which also seems to be endangered, and the hope that peace will rise from this mire of devastation, that someday we can all come to the table of shared values, raise a glass to building productive futures, and leave behind a violent past and quit clinging to distorted, archaic paradigms. Therefore, fair listener, let's start with some geography. Then we'll get into the history, regions, styles, and some recent good news. Yes, good news about Ukrainian wine. There's a little bit out there. First of all, you might be asking, where is it on a map? Ukraine is in Eastern Europe. This country is actually smaller than the state of Texas, according to the CIA fact book, yet it is the largest European country if you don't count Russia. Ukraine's southern border is on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. You may have heard those words a lot in the news recently. To its east is Russia. North is Belarus. To its west, from north to south, is Poland, a sliver of Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and the Republic of Moldova is actually tucked into a southwestern crook of the country, which also borders Romania. It's east of the Carpathian Mountains. Seriously, it's a very interesting map, and the only reason I'm as familiar with it as I am, which isn't very, is because of wine. I linked up a CIA World Factbook page on Ukraine, so you can poke around there if you'd like. And if you've been to any of these places, you know that the climate is considered continental, meaning all the seasons. The exception is the southern coast of Crimea. Remember, the Mediterranean moderating effects of large bodies of water, it's pretty well suited for viticulture, and it's been happening here for centuries, which brings us to history. Along the shore of the Black Sea, sometime around the 6th century BC, ancient Greeks settled here to plant the first vineyards. Evidence of winemaking has been found around the Crimean Peninsula, including amphorae and wine presses dating back to 4th century BC. Yet, the history of this region is complex. Some of it differs depending on where we are in the country. The first community of Slavs in the Ukrainian steppes was established between the 4th and 7th centuries, and they were perfectly positioned for frequent invasions by, you guessed it, Goths, Huns, all those guys. In the 9th century, some Vikings came along, yes, those guys too, of the Scandinavian variety, and they took over, thus freeing the Slavs from what had been Turkic control. Well, guess who shows up in the Ukrainian history? Mongols. That's right. In the 10th and 11th century, about 1 to 200 years before Genghis Khan, but still subject to Mongol plundering nonetheless. Because the former Slavic state, by this time Kievan Rus, as it was made up of Finns and Baltics and Norse, and they weren't able to stand strong on their own. There was perilous infighting and invasions by, you guessed it, aforementioned barbarians. It was then absorbed into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by way of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. That's also according to the CIA fact book. It was also around this time wine culture was sprouting thanks to, you know it, monks. Of course there were monks. They were key to establishing wine culture in the northern part of Ukraine. Monks, barbarians, Vikings, all in the same episode. Get out your wine podcast bingo cards just in case some swashbucklers come galloping up on horseback. So yes, in the Middle Ages, wine trade was actually happening with other countries because of their location. Although the Genoese actually owned part of the region around Sudak on the Black Sea. There was some Ottoman influence in there somewhere around the 15th century as well. There was an offshoot of deep history involving Russia, Tamerlane, Timur. Remember the Uzbekistan wine episode? They were controlling trade dealing in and around the Black Sea ports. In 1648, the Cossack Hetmanate was formed in what is today right smack in the middle of Ukraine. In other words, it became its own country after the eastern parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had, guess what? Another uprising of its own. Put simply, from 1648, Ukraine was doing its own independent thing for over 100 years. That is until Russia hoovered up most of the territory in 1764. Yet, even under Tsarist Russia, viticulture was promoted under Catherine the Great, according to the Vine Plus website. Catherine brought in a German scientist to plant vineyards in the warmer region of the Crimean Peninsula. Why? It was comparable to some of the very Italian, French, Spanish sites that we all know and love with respect to their own regions with Mediterranean climates. So they knew the grapes did well here. This dude, 1H Peter Paulus, he's not only credited for planting some of the larger vineyard areas, but also for documenting no fewer than 40 autochthonous grapes in this area. Swiss immigrants also brought winemaking know-how here in 1822, exactly 200 years ago. I'm going to link up the Swiss wine episode in case Swiss wine was a moment for any new listeners. And I also found a really great article on a Swiss website that talks about the history of this settlement. It was Tsar Alexander who told them, hey, cool place, this Black Sea region. Go forth and prosper. I promise it'll be great. Probably not in those words, but for a few decades, it actually was great. Originally from the Vaud canton, these French-speaking Swiss actually changed the name of their settlement from the Turkish, looks like Aşağıbağ, which was hard to pronounce. It means lower gardens or lower vineyards. Then they changed it to Şabağ and then eventually Szabo. Under the guidance of the Swiss colony of winemakers led by Louis Tardon, Szabo won their first gold medal in 1847. In 1878, the Novi Svet winery was established by Prince Lev Golitsyn, and it's still in operation today. Golitsyn is also credited with producing Crimean sparkling wine known as Shampanskoye Krimskoye a decade later. Oh, and remember Tsar Nicholas II, that guy? He actually directed the prince to start up a state winery called Masandra in the Crimea. This was in 1894. He was carrying on work that had been done by Mikhail Vorontsov, another prince who had been working at establishing viticulture in this area, and he also set up Crimea's first winemaking school in the first third of the century. Well, Nikitu, the Tsar, he wanted his own bespoke hooch supply, so Golitsyn built him a cellar. This complex network of underground wine storage and tunnels is the Masandra winery of today, although I need to note here that in 2020, Russian occupiers apparently sold Masandra to a Putin associate, so it's no longer Ukrainian-owned. Lana Bartolow's Forbes article dives into a fascinating history of the Masandra winery from its creation through nationalization and what Stalin had to do with any of it through today, and I linked that up too. In 1917, Ukraine managed to become independent yet again. You may remember from the vodka episode and might have mentioned in the Uzbekistan episode that this is when Tsarist Russia collapsed. But as the Roaring Twenties rolled around, that whole Soviet rule thing ruined everything as it tends to do and reconquered Ukraine once again. In the 1940s, the Swiss were basically driven out of their colony by the Red Army invasion. In other parts of Ukraine, not only was the wine culture neglected, it was intentionally destroyed as vines were uprooted. What I normally hear from people from other former Soviet bloc countries was that the production was focused on a lot of crap wine. Really don't worry about the quality, it's quantity that matters, and it's mostly sweet. We'll get to that in the next segment. Ukraine was one of the largest suppliers to the Soviet Union. And back then, I believe we called it the Ukraine. You can tell if you're old if you keep saying the Ukraine, but it's actually Ukraine. Neighboring Moldova also contributed a lot of wine to the Soviet Union. But some producers, like the aforementioned Masandra, was exempt from Gorbachev's whole Rip Up the Vines fest. And the Swiss-founded Szabo took pride in the wines they produced during that period as well. It didn't help that Gorbachev was on the anti-alcohol warpath toward the end of the Cold War, but the Ukrainians tried to preserve whatever research and infrastructure they could. Only in 1991, when we were finally able to kick the USSR regime to the curb, did Ukraine finally gain independence. But it was not an easy journey. Enter corruption, politics, actual rigged elections, regime changes, interventions, a struggle toward eventual democracy, and that brings us back here to today. Now, the politics behind this are not as clean as we all want to think, so I am not going to dive into that. That's not my area of expertise, nor is it the purpose of this episode, but it does bring us back to the current state of, I'll just say it, more barbarians and more fighting. I linked up a very recent article by Evan Rail that details precisely how Russia is once again threatening decades of progress in the Ukraine that the wine industry has made since the end of the 90s, not to mention other destruction. That's not to say that the wine industry doesn't have a bureaucratic stink on it. It does. We have it here too. We're not going to solve this today. We're here today to shine a light in this dark place on the wine and the wine culture. So now I think it's time to take a little tour of the wine regions. Vineyards have always been part of the wine culture in this part of the world. However, it was divided up over the centuries. The largest is in the southwest where Odessa is located. And this is where my wine comes from today. This is a region that has been under attack, yet it comprises nearly half of Ukraine's wine production area. Also based here is the Ukrainian Viticulture and Winemaking Institute. It just so happens that the wines I have from this region, including the biggest one, Shabo, it produces more than 50 million bottles a year. Again, not an ad. I purchased this wine. Most of the sparkling wine production is based in this area as well. Next is the occupied Crimean Peninsula, which I already mentioned. It used to account for 30% of the vines until 2014. And according to a 2018 piece by Olga Shailenko, the annexation of Crimea by Russia changed the way Ukraine makes wine for the better. This is because more than half of their sweeter styles, which is a lot of what they made, they were lost. And she's quoting the Association of Ukrainian Wine Growers here. They made the decision to start producing more dry styles for the world market, and they've been doing so incrementally since. Also, according to the Association of Ukrainian Wine Growers, Shailenko writes that the still wine exports tripled between 2014 and 2017. Not to mention increased awareness of the local wines. It grew to a point where the population started buying up. She said, well, if they're going to pay $3 for a bottle of European wine from another country or a bottle of Ukrainian, let's start buying up the Ukrainian wine. And with that focus on the local wines, winemakers also started to up their game. So that's a little bit of good news for the rest of the industry. But not so fortunate is the region in the south, and this is where Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk are located. And the area is getting shelled on the regular, including the wineries and vineyards. It's such a shame, as this region was also on the rise with respect to their dry winemaking game after the loss of Crimea. Not only are the Russians obliterating some wineries like Chateau Kurin, but they've occupied others, like the historic Prince Trubetskoy winery, both in the Kherson region. They've destroyed a wine and food warehouse worth 15 million euros, as well as a glass factory that produces wine bottles, both near Kiev. Now, some people can't even bottle their wines. Rail's article also interviews winemakers dealing with occupations, damage to facilities and infrastructure that is making wine production difficult to impossible in this area. Some of them don't know if they're going to have a harvest. Another region that upped its dry wine game after losing Crimea, including the reintroduction of native grapes destroyed by collectivist Soviet agricultural practices, is Zakarpattia or Transcarpathia. The first wine festival ever in Ukraine was in Transcarpathia in 1995, but winemaking has been part of this region's identity for over 100 years. It's in the west and borders Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary. And here we are looking at the foothills of the Carpathian Range as well as the Pannonian Plain. That's where we find Hungary. Also known for great growing areas, by the way, and since I'm part Hungarian, someday I do feel I owe you an episode on this. As in many other regions on the eastern side of the mountain range, they get some protection from cold fronts, similar to the rain shadow effect in Alsace. Also, in addition to the autochthonous grapes at home here, international varieties tend to do very well. This part of Ukraine is in the west. It's the furthest from the fighting for the most part. That said, a March 22 article by Rafaela Usai for Vine Plus magazine detailed at least one of the wineries in this region. Instead of making wine, they've amassed volunteers to make Molotov cocktails, also known as Bandera smoothies. Never heard that one before. In addition, they are also working to raise funds for aid organizations, make pillows, blankets for troops, etc. This article is a really great read. paid, and you can get a free subscription to this excellent resource to read the whole thing. You have to actually be a member, but it's free. And it's not an ad. It's not a partnership. I'm just sharing good information. I really like the Vine Plus website. The photos of the Somme and one of my fellow WSET grads in a military uniform was particularly sobering, as are the unexploded ordnances in the vines at the Slivino winery. There are also pictures of these Bandera smoothies in various wine and liquor bottles from around Europe, so I had to check out the labels, and you'd be surprised at some of them. I should also note that by the time this episode drops, some of this information could have changed, so please bear with me and respect that things change on the daily with the situation. With that, let's move on to grapes and styles. According to aforementioned Vine Plus, citing the Wine Growers Association of Ukraine's 2019 figures, vines comprised about 41,500 hectares. That's about 160 or more square miles and almost 103 acres. They grow almost 200 types of grapes in Ukraine. The usual international culprits are going to show up in the Ukrainian vineyards, led by Cabernet Sauvignon for the reds, including its Merlot I have in my glass today. The whites are led by the Georgian Original, or Cazzetelli, and Burgundy's Aligoté, followed by Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay. But they have an impressive list of autochthonous grapes, i.e. some I've never heard of. And I just know you want to hear me try to pronounce in Ukrainian in alphabetical order all these grapes. Or not. Here are two. I'll give you a white and a red. The white that I was able to find the most information on was the Telti Kurek, and I've actually seen single varietal bottlings of this from Szabo. It's known for floral aromas and acidity, and it dates back to that Turkic period pre-Vikings around the 5th century, according to the Szabo website. Telti Kurek translates to foxtail in Turkish because the grape clusters actually resemble a foxtail. Makes sense. The red grape that I found particularly interesting was the Odesky Cherny, also known as Ali Bernet. The Odesky Cherny translates to Black Odessa, and you often see it as Odessa Black on a bottle. It's a fun grape that Wine Grape says is a cross of Cabernet Sauvignon and Alicante Bouschet that dates back to 1948. It wasn't registered in Ukraine until 1972, but it was registered in other countries around that time as well, or a little bit later. You may remember Alicante Bouschet from season 4's Meet the Tenturier episode. Linked it up just in case. It's about those minority of grapes that actually have colored flesh and juice, where most juice from any color grape is clear. They call this Odessa Black the Mustang of red varieties, and I'm a little partial to the description. Here's why. A Mustang is what they call an enlisted person in the military that goes and gets a commission. At least in the Air Force, they did this. And I also did this, and I owned a pristine 5-liter Mustang for 12 years. And I'm a fan of the Mustang grape, gotta tell you. Furthermore, Odessa Black is spicy. Love that. Dark red and blackberry fruit flavors. I'm sure you saw that coming with its grape parentage. It sometimes has minty notes, which you know that Cabernet Sauvignon from Australia can gather from the iron-rich soils down there. But this does offer a structure to the wines, kind of like Cabernet's daddy, really. Wines produced with Odessa Black are also known, as you might guess, for deep color. There we are. And the Ukraine Now website touts this as, quote, the future identity of Ukraine. I will certainly raise a glass to this gutsy Mustang as the future identity of Ukraine. Doesn't that say a lot with all we've learned to this point? Now, all colors, all styles of wine, you may have gathered, are produced here. We've mentioned sparkling, red, white. They do dry, they do sweet, they do whites, reds, rosés, sparkling sweet rosés, still, dessert wines, single varietals, blends, and yes, one of my cork dorky faves, orange or amber wines made from white grapes. I linked up an episode on that. I think it's time to get to some recent good news. From Decanter, early in June 2022, Decanter announced the results of their World Wine Awards. If you're not familiar with this is a huge event that involved over 18,000 wines from 54 countries. Lots of masters of wines, master somms, the wine cognoscenti hanging out from all over the world. It's a big freaking deal. I linked up the article by Olivia Mason so you can check out all the stats and all the kudos. And there's also a cool video describing the event, complete with the compulsory slow motion wine glass swirling and sniffing shots. Gotta have those in there. Notable was the gold medal for the 2019 Reserve Chardonnay Nikolaev by Baykush Winery. According to the article, this winery had to deliver its bottles through Hungary just to get them to the competition. Chris Mercer's Decanter article from April further details the operation. There are photos of the bottles, which appear to be in luggage with blurred labels because nobody was supposed to see the wine names before the judging. Makes sense. According to Mercer's piece, in early April, Bakush Winery, located on the Black Sea coast, started moving pallet loads of vines to safer areas in western Ukraine. Then, one case at a time, the vines for the wine awards were moved over the border and then eventually flown to London via friends and family, one being the brother of famous tennis pro Sergei Stakhovsky. Stakhovsky also has a winery near Bakush, so they were willing to help, but Stakhovsky is actually out fighting in the Ukraine military right now. Noted also is that Ukraine's first ever gold medal at the event was last year in 2021, so there's some tangible evidence that the wine quality in Ukraine is on the rise. I'd like to close this by saying in March, I did have the opportunity to purchase some Ukrainian wine in an effort to directly support military endeavors in this beautiful country. The folks at Tribeca Wine Merchants in New York, through an effort with Drinking and Knowing Things author Michael Juergens, aka the Bhutan Wine Guy, they put together a case of available Ukrainian wines in the U.S. with $50 for each case going to help the Army SOS. I will link up that Army SOS site if you would like to help them. It's a volunteer organization that collects, distributes, and manufactures radio communications, military equipment, and weapons as and when they are needed. And I also linked up an interview with some of their personnel. As a former aerial platform communications geek myself, I'm inspired by the SOS's development and deployment of UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles. If supporting war efforts is not your thing, it's not everybody's all cool with that, there are other organizations listed on the website that directly help Ukrainians. Or just start looking for Ukrainian wine and buy up. If you already know they make vodka, you know that from the vodka episode, that's a little easier to find. What better way to toast the Ukrainian spirit than with Ukrainian spirits? I'll end this episode by raising my glass to all those fighting for democracy, peace, and human decency around the world. In Ukraine, they have a saying, budmor, which is a toast you might hear upon the clinking of glasses. Simply put, it means let us be. I linked up an article with the details on that toast because they are serious toasters in Ukraine. And you might have heard a Slava Ukraini or Slava Ukraini, depending on your accent. Slava Ukraini simply means glory to Ukraine. So I will end with that. And spasiba, thank you for making room in your podcast feed for Glass in Session every couple of weeks. This was a particularly difficult episode to put together. So if you made it all the way through, thank you so much for listening and for caring. And if you can get your hands on any Ukrainian wines, please let me know. I would like to try some more. I'm on Twitter at WineGale Unboxed. Email me at val@glassinSession. On the Facebook, Pinterest, and Insta Spaces, I'm Vino with Val. Glass in Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. Website is glassinsession.com/podcast.